The land west of the Pecos River was a vast, rolling sea of dust and determination. It was a place where a man's character was measured by the calluses on his hands and the strength of his word, and where the sun set each evening not on cities, but on silences so deep you could hear your own heart beating. In this rugged country stood the Miller Ranch, a sturdy spread of timber and hope, built piece by Clayton Miller and his son Clay. Clay was a young man of few words, but his actions spoke in volumes. He understood the language of the wind, the needs of a nervous calf, and the precise amount of pressure needed to shoe a stubborn horse. What he did not understand, what filled him with a quiet dread, were the complicated matters of the heart. His father, a man whose faith was as solid as the old oak table in their kitchen, had seen his son's loneliness. He had written to an old friend from his wagon train days, a man named Abner Abbott who had settled a few hundred miles north. Letters were exchanged, prayers were whispered, and an agreement was reached. Clay was to marry Abner's daughter Rose. It was a sensible arrangement, one that would join two good families and ensure both a future. Clay, trusting his father completely, had agreed. But as the day of her arrival drew near, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. The only hint of the woman who was to become his wife was a small, faded tintype photograph. It had arrived in a crisp envelope, and Clay had held it with the careful reverence of someone handling a holy object. The image was blurry, the subject stiff and formal. The girl in the picture had her hair pulled back severely, her eyes looking somewhere just beyond the camera, her mouth a solemn line. She looked plain, simple. And for a man like Clay, who found the world of fancy dresses and sophisticated city women to be confusing and intimidating, this was a relief. He convinced himself that this was for the best. A plain wife for a plain man. They would build a life on shared work and quiet understanding. There would be no grand, confusing emotions to navigate. He made a solemn promise to himself, standing by the corral as the horses shuffled in the dawn light, that he would be a good man to her. He would provide for her, protect her, and be faithful. He would find contentment in partnership, even if the stories he'd heard of dizzying, heart-pounding love were not to be a part of his story. The day of Rose's arrival was etched in heat. The sun was a blazing coin in a pale, washed-out sky, and the air in the little town of Oak Creek was thick and still. Clay stood on the wooden platform outside the stagecoach office, his best shirt feeling too tight around his neck. He clutched his hat in his hands, turning the brim round and round until the felt was warm and soft. The distant sound of the coach horn sent a jolt through him. The world seemed to hold its breath as the stagecoach, a cloud of dust and noise, rumbled into town and creaked to a groaning halt. The door swung open. A traveling salesman in a wrinkled suit stepped down first, followed by a weary-looking woman with a squalling infant. And then there she was. A hand, gloved in simple cotton, reached out to steady herself on the doorframe. Then she emerged, stepping down into the dusty street with a grace that seemed out of place in the rough frontier town. This was not the plain girl from the photograph. The young woman who stood before him, smoothing the wrinkles from her traveling skirt, was different. Her hair, the color of rich honey, had escaped its pins and soft tendrils that framed her face. Her eyes, which in the picture had seemed dull, were a warm, clear blue, like the sky after a storm. She had a small, straight nose and a mouth that even in its nervousness, seemed ready to smile. She was not beautiful in a sharp, dazzling way that might make a man feel small, but in a gentle, real way that made Clay's heart do a strange, lurching stumble in his chest. She was the most lovely creature he had ever seen. All his carefully prepared speeches, his simple words of welcome, vanished from his mind like mist in the morning sun. The shock of her appearance, so contrary to his expectations, locked the words in his throat. He could only stare, his mouth slightly agape, his own plainness feeling suddenly immense and clumsy next to her quiet loveliness. Rose Abbott, for her part, had been just as nervous on the long journey. She had prayed for a kind man, a God-fearing man who would welcome her. She had clutched her own small Bible in her lap, seeking comfort. When her eyes found the tall, broad-shouldered young man waiting on the platform, her first feeling was one of relief. He looked strong and honest. But as she approached and saw the look on his face, not a smile of welcome but a stunned, almost dismayed silence, her hope began to curdle into confusion. He didn't say a word. Not welcome, not I'm Clay, nothing. His eyes swept over her and she saw no pleasure in them. A cold dread settled in her stomach. He was disappointed. He had seen her and he found her wanting. The rejection was as sharp and sudden as a slap, and it took all her willpower not to turn and climb back into the coach. The wedding took place 2 hours later in the simple, whitewashed church at the end of the main street. The pastor's words echoed in the near-empty room. Clay's voice was a low, gruff murmur when he said, "I do." Rose's was a trembling whisper. She placed a simple gold band on his finger, her own hand shaking. He did the same for her, his large, work-roughened fingers surprisingly gentle. They were man and wife. The ride back to the ranch in the wagon was a journey undertaken in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The prairie dogs chattered and the hawks wheeled overhead, but between the two young people on the wagon seat, there was only the sound of the wind and the crushing weight of a terrible misunderstanding. The ranch house was clean and sturdy. Clay showed her to a small bedroom at the back of the house, the one that would be hers. He had carried her trunk in himself. The evening stretched before them, awkward and endless. They ate a supper of cold chicken and bread, the clinking of their forks the only conversation. Rose tried to ask a question about the ranch, her voice soft and hopeful. Clay, his mind still reeling, his shyness a fortress around him, could only manage a short, mumbled reply. As the fire in the hearth died down to embers, Clay knew he had to say something. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He looked at Rose, who sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking small and lost. "The house is yours," he began, his voice rough with nerves. I'll be sleeping in the barn. To give you time, to get settled. To have your own space." He meant it as an act of kindness, a gesture of respect for the stranger he had married. But to Rose, whose heart was already bruised from his silence, it was the final, confirming blow. He did not want her. He could not even bear to share the same roof with her through the night. She simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She lay in the strange narrow bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night, the cry of a coyote, the lowing of a distant cow, the rustle of the wind in the tall grass. The tears came then, hot and silent, soaking into the coarse cotton of the pillowcase. She had left her home, her family, everything she knew, to come to a man who looked at her and saw a mistake. She felt utterly and completely alone, a weed planted in the wrong soil, destined to wither. She prayed a desperate, wordless prayer into the darkness, begging God for a reason, for a sign, for a shred of hope in this lonely new world that felt so much like a prison. Outside, under a blanket of a million stars, Clay Miller lay on a bed of hay in the barn, staring up at the dark rafters, wondering why God had sent him a beautiful wife, and why he felt like he had already failed her so completely. The chasm between them, dug by fear and misunderstanding, seemed wider and deeper than the Grand Canyon itself. The dawn that broke over the Miller Ranch the next morning was a pale and cheerless affair. Inside the quiet house, Rose awoke with a heart that felt as heavy as a stone. The hope that had journeyed with her on the stagecoach had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard reality. She dressed slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as if making too much noise might shatter the fragile silence of the house and bring forth the disapproval of the husband who had chosen a bed of hay over one under the same roof as her. She found her way to the kitchen, a room of sturdy pots and a well-scrubbed table, and began the work of making breakfast not out of joy, but out of a deep-seated sense of duty. It was the one thing she knew she could do correctly, the one small piece of her old life she could transplant into this barren new one. When Clay came in from the barn, his hair tousled and his shirt smelling faintly of hay and horses, the air in the room grew thick with things left unsaid. He nodded a silent greeting, his eyes darting away from hers almost as soon as they met. They ate the hot biscuits and gravy she had prepared without looking at one another, the only sound the scraping of forks on tin plates and the loud, ticking clock on the mantelpiece. It was a pattern that would repeat itself, day after long day, turning into weeks that bled into a month. Their life became a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. Clay would rise before the sun, his departure from the house as quiet as a ghost. He would spend every waking hour from first light to last on the far reaches of the ranch, mending fences that did not need such urgent mending, chasing down stray cattle that were not truly lost, finding any task that would keep his body busy and his mind numb to the problem waiting for him in the house. He convinced himself he was giving her the space she must surely desire, the freedom from his awkward, disappointing presence. In truth, he was hiding, his own fear a constant companion. Every time he saw her, so lovely and so out of place in his rough world, he was reminded of his own failure to be the man a woman like her deserved. He saw the way she kept the house spotless, the way she mended his shirts with tiny, perfect stitches, and he interpreted her quiet competence as a silent reproach, a confirmation that she was merely fulfilling a contract, not building a life. Rose, for her part, poured all her confusion and heartache into her work. She scrubbed floors until they shone, organized the pantry with meticulous care, and baked bread until the house was perpetually filled with its warm, comforting scent. She was trying to earn her keep, to prove her worth in the only way she knew how. She watched Clay retreat from her, his silence a wall she did not know how to scale. She began to believe that his rejection was absolute and final, that he saw her as little more than a burden he was forced to bear, a piece of fancy furniture that did not fit in his simple log cabin life. She ate her meals in silence, slept in her lonely bed, and spent her evenings staring out the small window of her room, watching the vast empty landscape and feeling a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. She began to pray not for love, but simply for the strength to endure, for the grace to live a life of quiet service without the hope of companionship. The turning point, as it often does in lives touched by faith, came from outside the suffocating silence of their home. Sunday arrived, and out of habit and duty, they dressed in their best clothes and rode the wagon into town for the church service. They sat side by side on the hard wooden pew, a respectable distance between them, a picture of a married couple that fooled no one, least of all the kind-eyed Pastor John. He stood before his small flock that morning and began to speak from the famous chapter on love in the Bible. His voice was gentle but firm, filling the small church. "Love is patient," he read, his eyes seeming to sweep over every face in the congregation. "Love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs." Each word landed on Clay's heart with the weight of a hammer. He had promised to love this woman, but had he been patient? Had he been kind? He had been proud, too proud to admit his fear, and he had kept a record of the wrong he imagined she had done him simply by being different from his expectation. He sat straighter, the words piercing the armor of his shyness. Rose listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The pastor continued, "Love does not delight in evil but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres." A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She had been protecting her heart, but she had not been hoping. She had not been persevering in anything but her own sorrow. The sermon was not about a feeling, it was about a choice, an action. It was a roadmap for a journey they had not even begun. The ride home was as always quiet, but the silence now was different. It was a thoughtful silence, charged with the echoes of the pastor's words. Later that afternoon, Clayton Miller found his son staring out over the pasture, his brow furrowed in deep thought. The older man placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Son," he said, his voice low and steady, "a man can spend so long looking at the shadow he's afraid of that he misses the sunshine standing right behind him. That girl in there has a heart of gold. I see the way she looks at you when you're not watching. There's no anger in her eyes, Clay. There's only hurt. And a man repairs the hurt he causes. It's that simple." Inside, Rose was in the kitchen, her own heart in turmoil. The sermon had lit a small, flickering candle of hope in her darkness. Love was a choice. She could choose to stop waiting for him to love her and could choose to show love to him, even if it was never returned. It was a terrifying thought to make herself vulnerable again, but her faith gave her a courage she didn't know she possessed. With a deep breath, she decided to bake a blackberry pie, his favorite, from the last of the preserves she had brought with her from her mother's kitchen. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it was an act of hope, a choice to extend an olive branch from the depths of her loneliness. The smell of the baking pie finally drew Clay in from the yard as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her as she worked, her back to him. He saw the careful way she wiped a floury hand on her apron, the gentle slope of her shoulders. He thought of his father's words. He thought of the pastor's sermon. The weight of his own foolishness finally became too heavy to bear. He cleared his throat, a rough, nervous sound. Rose turned, her eyes wide with surprise. For a long moment they just looked at each other, the chasm of the last month stretching between them. Then Clay took a step forward. His voice, when it came, was husky and filled with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Rose," he began, I owe you the biggest apology a man has ever had to make. I've been a fool. A proud, scared fool." He looked down at his boots, gathering his words. "That picture I had of you, it was plain. And I thought that's what I wanted. A simple life with no complications. But then you stepped off that stage and you were so beautiful. Scared me. I thought a beautiful woman like you would never be happy with a simple, quiet man like me. I thought you'd see this ranch and see me and be disappointed. So I built a wall. I thought if I stayed away I wouldn't have to see that disappointment in your eyes. I was so wrong. I was blind. I thought I wanted plain, but God sent me beautiful inside and out, and I was too much of a coward to see it." The words tumbled out of him, a raw and honest confession that shattered the last of Rose's defenses. The tears she had been holding back for weeks now flowed freely, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. "Oh, Clay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought you were silent because you didn't want me. I thought you saw me and found me lacking. I thought you regretted our marriage from the very first moment you saw me." The misunderstanding, so vast and painful, now seemed so small and silly in the face of their shared honesty. The wall between them, built of fear and pride, crumbled into dust. That night, for the first time, they sat at the kitchen table together after supper and simply talked. They talked about their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Clay told her about his dream to raise the finest cattle in the territory. Rose spoke of her love for growing things, of the garden she wished to plant. They laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed in the house that had known only silence for too long. It was a new beginning. It was not the end of the story but the true start of it. The courtship that should have happened before their marriage began that night, in the warm glow of the lamplight, as two lonely hearts finally found the courage to reach for one another. The seasons turned over the Miller Ranch with a gentle, predictable rhythm, each one painting the land in new colors and bringing with it the steady, comforting work of a life lived close to the earth. The long, silent winter that had once gripped the house in its icy fist had thawed, not with the spring sun, but with the warmth of two hearts finally learning to beat as one. The change within the sturdy log walls was as profound as it was simple. Where there had been silence, there was now the easy flow of conversation. Where there had been lonely meals, there were now shared suppers filled with discussions about the day's events, dreams for the future, and sometimes the sweet, comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed words to feel connected. Clay's love for Rose was no longer a hesitant promise but a living, breathing thing, evident in the way he would leave a wildflower on the windowsill for her to find, or how his hand would gently rest on her shoulder as he passed her chair. Rose's love for Clay was in the mended shirts, the always full coffee pot, and the light that had returned to her eyes, a light that was now reflected back at her in her husband's gaze. Their love, born from the ashes of misunderstanding and nurtured by choice and faith, became the cornerstone of their lives. They were a team in every sense of the word. Rose learned to ride a horse, not side saddle like a fine lady from the East, but astride, so she could accompany Clay to the far pastures, her presence a comfort and a joy to him during the long days of work. Clay, in turn, helped Rose clear a patch of land near the house for the garden she had dreamed of, his strong arms turning the stubborn soil while she carefully planned the rows for vegetables and the spot for her beloved flowers. They built a small porch together, plank by plank, and in the evenings they would sit there, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, their hands intertwined. The ranch was no longer just Clay's inheritance. It was their shared future, a testament to the love they had built with their own hands and hearts, blessed by the God who had brought them together. It was on one such quiet evening, with the fireflies beginning their nightly dance over the meadow, that Rose shared the news that would make their joy complete. She placed her hand over his on the rough-hewn wood of the porch railing and told him, her voice soft but sure, that they were to have a child. The emotion that washed over Clay's face was more powerful than any he had ever known, a staggering mixture of awe, gratitude, and a fierce, protective love that brought tears to his eyes. He pulled his wife into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in all the world, which to him she was. Their prayers of thanksgiving that night were not whispered, but spoken aloud with full hearts, their voices joined in gratitude for the miracle growing within her. The news spread through the small community of Oak Creek, and their happiness was shared by all who knew them, for everyone could see the transformation love had wrought in the once lonely rancher and his gentle wife. The months that followed were a time of preparation and eager anticipation. Clay, with his father's help, carefully crafted a cradle from a piece of fine, smooth oak, sanding it until it was silken to the touch. Rose, her hands busy and her heart full, sewed tiny gowns and knitted small blankets, her mind filled with dreams of the child who would wear them. Their home was filled with a palpable sense of waiting, a joyful expectancy that made even the hardest day's labor feel light. Rose bloomed with the life she carried, her face radiant, her spirit peaceful. Clay watched over her with a tender, almost reverent care, his love for her deepening with every passing day. They often spoke of the child, wondering if it would be a boy with his father's strong hands or a girl with her mother's kind eyes, and they prayed together that their son or daughter would grow to know the same steadfast faith that had guided them through the wilderness of their own hearts and into this promised land of love. The night the baby decided to arrive was a night of howling wind and driving rain, as if all the elements had gathered to witness this momentous event. Clay, his face etched with a concern he tried hard to mask, rode swiftly through the storm to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Gable, the kind and capable midwife from town. Back at the ranch, the hours stretched long and tense. Clay paced the main room of the house, his prayers a continuous, silent stream. Every cry from the other room felt like a physical blow, and the fear that had once been a stranger to him in recent months returned with a vengeance, whispering of loss and fragility. He listened to the wind rattling the shutters and felt a profound helplessness, realizing that this was a trial he could not fix with his hands or his strength. It was a journey Rose had to take, and all he could do was wait and trust in the Lord. It was the longest night of his life, a brutal test of the faith he had so carefully built. Then, just as the first hint of gray dawn began to lighten the sky and the storm finally abated, a new sound filled the house. It was a strong, healthy cry, a powerful declaration of new life. The door to the bedroom opened and Mrs. Gable appeared, her face weary but beaming. "You can come in now, Clay," she said softly. He stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Rose lay in the bed, exhausted but glowing, her face the very picture of triumphant love. And in her arms, swaddled tightly in one of the blankets she had knitted, was their daughter. He moved to the bedside as if in a dream, his large frame seeming to fill the small room. He looked down at the tiny, perfect face, at the rosebud mouth and the shock of fine, dark hair, and his breath caught in his throat. Rose looked up at him, her love for him shining in her eyes. "We have a daughter, Clay," she whispered. He reached out a trembling finger, and the baby's tiny hand curled around it with a surprising strength. In that moment, holding his wife's hand and his daughter's finger, Clay Miller felt the final piece of his heart settle into its rightful place. He looked from the baby to Rose, his vision blurring with tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "She's perfect," he breathed. "You are both so perfect." They named her Lily, for she was as pure and beautiful as the flower that symbolized new beginnings and unwavering faith. As he held his daughter for the first time, cradling her with an instinctive gentleness, he looked at Rose, his voice thick with emotion. "Our story didn't start the way I expected," he said, his words meant for her alone. "I was lost in my own fears, building walls when I should have been building a home. But God knew the path to this perfect moment. He gave me a second chance to love you, and now He has given us a family. This, my beautiful Rose, is our forever after." Years later, the memory of that morning remained as bright and clear as the day it happened. The Miller Ranch thrived, its pastures greener, its fences stronger, its home filled with laughter and prayer. Lily grew from a curious toddler into a bright-eyed girl, her father's shadow in the barn and her mother's helper in the garden. On a warm summer evening, the family of three stood on the porch they had built together. Clay's arm was wrapped firmly around Rose's shoulders, and she held a sleeping Lily in her arms. The sunset painted the sky in glorious shades of gold and crimson, a masterpiece that seemed created just for them. They watched in a comfortable silence, a family bound not just by blood, but by a love that had been tested, chosen, and blessed. They had walked through a valley of loneliness and emerged onto a sunlit plain of shared joy, their faith the compass that had guided them all the way home. Their story was a testament to the truth that the greatest loves are not always the ones that arrive with a flash of lightning, but are often the ones that grow slowly, patiently, from the smallest seed of hope, watered with kindness and warmed by the steady light of faith. If this story of faith, forgiveness, and the power of a second chance touched your heart, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel for more tales of hope and love that reminds us of the beautiful plans that await when we trust in a higher purpose. Your support helps us share these messages of light. Thank you for watching, and may your own story be filled with faith and love.